The desert air was still when she arrived at the forward camp, her boots sinking into the dust as if the ground itself resisted her presence. Soldiers moved aside when they saw her, not because she outranked them, she did not, but because there was something in her eyes that reminded them of nights without sleep, of gunfire that never seemed to end, of losses they would rather not count. Her name was Kira, and in the eyes of command she was a problem. Too sharp with her words, too unwilling to bow, too determined to carve her own path through a war that had already eaten thousands of lives. They had tried to silence her before. Reassignment papers shuffled between desks, reports rewritten until her victories seemed like accidents, her failures inflated into disasters. But she had endured it all with the same stoic calm, carrying her rifle as though it was not just a weapon but the only honest companion left in a world where loyalty was bought, sold, and discarded in the dust. The camp was tense. You could feel it in the way soldiers cleaned their rifles too quickly, in the clipped tones of officers barking orders without conviction, in the faint tremor of a radio signal that kept cutting in and out with bursts of static. The enemy was close. Everyone knew it, though command continued to speak of routine patrols and minor incursions, as if their carefully chosen words could mask the smell of fear drifting through the tents. Kira walked to her assigned post without a word. She did not salute the officer who handed her the mission packet, and he didn't demand one. The truth was, they were as wary of her as they were of the enemy. Whispers followed her wherever she went, that she had seen too much, that she had fought too hard, that she no longer belonged in neat lines of soldiers obeying orders without thought. That night, while the others huddled by firelight, she lay on her back staring at the stars. The sky was so wide it seemed endless, but to her it felt like a ceiling pressing down, trapping her in a world where escape was impossible. She ran her hand over the length of her rifle, feeling the cool metal, the small scratches that marked battles past. To others it was a tool. To her it was something else. Not alive perhaps, but not entirely inanimate either. It was her voice when command told her to stay silent. It was her shield when allies turned their backs. It was the echo of her will, precise and unyielding. More than once she had felt that the rifle chose the moment to act, guiding her hands faster than thought, striking targets she had not fully seen. People laughed when she hinted at this, saying stress and adrenaline twisted perception. But deep inside, Kira wondered if her weapon understood her better than any human ever could. The order came at dawn. They were to move out before nightfall, sweep the ridge to the north, and flush out enemy scouts that had been shadowing supply lines. The officer's voice carried no authority, only the weary cadence of a man repeating words given to him by someone else. Kira listened in silence, her jaw set. She knew what this was. A mission framed as routine but designed to erase her. They would send her out where enemy fire was thickest, position her in the exposed valley, and when she fell they would write in their reports that it was inevitable, that she had taken one risk too many. The plan was clean on paper, but command had forgotten one thing. She had survived far worse traps. As the squad advanced, the landscape stretched barren and unforgiving, broken only by jagged stones that looked like the teeth of some ancient beast. The sun pounded on their helmets, sweat stung their eyes, and the air shimmered with heat. Soldiers muttered curses under their breath, but Kira marched without complaint, her eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. She could feel it, the tension building, the air thickening as if the earth itself held its breath. The enemy was near, waiting, watching. Her squad leader signaled them to fan out, but she stayed close to the ridge, her instincts refusing to trust the pattern drilled into them by command. When the first shots cracked across the valley they weren't surprised, they were ready. But readiness did not save the men who hesitated, nor the officer who believed the plan would go smoothly. Gunfire erupted like a storm tearing through silence. Dust exploded around them as bullets tore into the rocks. Kira hit the ground and rolled, her rifle already finding targets. She did not fire blindly. Every shot was deliberate, measured, final. She watched the enemy move, shadows darting between stones, flashes of muzzle fire, and each time her fingers squeezed the trigger, another threat fell. Her squad scrambled, shouting orders lost beneath the roar, but their formation was already broken. Some dropped and did not rise again. Others tried to retreat, only to be caught in crossfire. The officer who had dismissed her warnings earlier screamed into his comms for reinforcements, his voice cracking, until a round caught him in the throat and silenced him forever. For a moment, chaos threatened to consume everything. Then the rifle settled in her hands, steady as breath. It was as if it spoke, not in words but in certainty. She shifted positions, sliding across gravel, each movement precise, each shot echoing like a verdict. Time slowed. The terror that gripped her squad did not touch her. She was beyond it, operating in a space where fear had no weight. Enemies rose and fell, and though their numbers were many, they could not pierce the invisible wall she built with every bullet. Soldiers near her, once panicked, began to follow her lead, firing where she fired, moving when she moved. She had become the rhythm of the fight, the anchor in the storm. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, the valley was silent again. Smoke drifted from blackened craters. Bodies lay scattered across the stones, friend and foe indistinguishable except by the stillness that claimed them. Of the squad, only a handful remained, their faces pale, eyes hollow. They looked at her not with gratitude but with something deeper, a recognition that she had carried them through when command had abandoned them. She rose, dust clinging to her uniform, and slung the rifle across her shoulder. No words were needed. The rifle had spoken louder than any order, louder than any attempt to bury her under silence. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in the fortified towers where officers watched from safety, command would receive the report. They would read of an ambush that should have ended her. They would frown at the survival of a woman they had marked for removal. And they would wonder, though they would never say it aloud, if perhaps the battle had been decided not by strategy, not by rank, but by the bond between a soldier and her weapon. A bond stronger than their power, stronger than their silence, and strong enough to turn the tide before dark. Night fell heavy over the desert, not with peace but with the weight of everything left unsaid. The survivors of the ridge sat huddled around a dim fire, their silence louder than any speech. Faces smudged with dirt and streaked with dried blood stared into the flames, as if searching for meaning in their survival. No one dared to look too long at Kira. She sat apart, her rifle balanced across her knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of light. She was not excluded by force but by something deeper, the unspoken recognition that she had seen the battle through a lens none of them could touch. Where they had stumbled and panicked, she had walked straight into the storm, her weapon cutting a path through chaos as if it had a will of its own. For them, survival felt like chance. For her, it felt inevitable. But command did not share their gratitude. Hours after the fight, a courier drone descended from the black sky, its rotors slicing the silence. The message it carried was brief, its language sharp and bureaucratic. She was to report back at once for debrief and reassignment. The survivors exchanged uneasy glances as she read the words by firelight. They all knew what it meant. Command wanted her gone, folded into some distant outpost where her presence would no longer remind them of their own failures. They had sent her to die and she had returned instead. That defiance demanded correction. She folded the message neatly and tucked it into her vest without a word, but the firelight caught the faint curve of a smile at the corner of her lips, a smile that was not joy but challenge. At dawn, the survivors broke camp, limping back toward the fortified lines. The desert stretched endless, each mile a reminder of how small they were against the vastness of war. Buzzards circled overhead, and the wind carried the metallic tang of dried blood. Some soldiers whispered that they would desert, vanish into the wastelands rather than face another mission dictated by officers who treated lives like chess pieces. Kira walked in silence, her boots steady, her rifle slung but never far from her grasp. Every step felt like a march toward a reckoning she could no longer avoid. The base loomed by midday, a sprawl of steel and concrete scarred by years of conflict. Towers bristled with antennas, and armored vehicles rolled through the gates with the indifference of machines that had seen too much. As they entered, the survivors were herded into separate lines for medical checks, debriefs and interrogations thinly disguised as interviews. Kira was pulled aside, escorted by two officers whose eyes never met hers. They led her down a narrow corridor deep into the command bunker, where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the air smelled of recycled metal and stale coffee. She was made to sit in a bare room, its walls painted with the same dull gray that seemed to swallow all sense of time. A single camera blinked red in the corner, recording every breath she took. After what felt like an hour, a man entered, Colonel Varick, one of the architects of the campaign, his uniform crisp, his boots polished so brightly they reflected the sterile light. He looked at her not as a soldier but as an inconvenience. "Your report," he said flatly, sliding a datapad across the table. "Write everything. Leave nothing out." His tone left no room for protest, but Kira did not reach for the pad. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady on his. "The ridge was your trap," she said. "No accusation, just fact." The colonel's jaw tightened, but he did not confirm nor deny. Silence filled the space between them like a second presence. She let it hang there until the air itself seemed to strain. You wanted me gone. But I'm here. And the men who followed me are alive because I did what your orders couldn't." Her voice was low, calm, but every word cut. Varric's expression flickered just slightly, the faintest tremor of anger, or was it fear? "Careful, Sergeant," he murmured. "You speak as though your loyalty is in question." She almost laughed. Loyalty, she thought, was not owed to men who treated soldiers like expendable numbers. Her loyalty belonged to the fight itself, to the survival of those who still clung to life at her side, and perhaps most of all, to the rifle that had never betrayed her. When she finally reached for the datapad, she did not write the story they expected. She described the chaos, the collapse of formation, the officer who had died screaming into his comms. She detailed the panic, the confusion, the certainty that their mission had been sabotage. But she did not name names, nor did she accuse directly. Instead, she left her words sharp but ambiguous, a report that could not be disproven but carried the weight of truth beneath the surface. Varric read it in silence, his face blank, but his knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. She was dismissed but not released. 4 days she remained confined within the base, moving between barracks, training grounds, and endless interrogations that circled the same questions. What did she see? Who gave the order? Did she suspect betrayal? She answered with precision, never giving them more than they deserved. In those days her rifle never left her side. The others stored their weapons in lockers, but she carried hers openly, cleaning it in the mess hall, resting it across her lap in the barracks, walking with it slung over her shoulder through the corridors of command itself. Some laughed nervously, others whispered of paranoia. But those who had been with her on the ridge understood. They had seen the rifle speak and they knew it was more than steel and gunpowder. It was on the 4th night that the base came under attack. Sirens howled through the corridors and the ground shook with the impact of mortar fire. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and soldiers scrambled half-dressed from their bunks. Kira was already awake, sitting in the dark, her rifle balanced in her hands as though she had been waiting for this moment. She moved swiftly through the chaos, past panicked men and women who clutched at helmets and rifles with trembling hands. Explosions tore through the perimeter, sending plumes of fire into the sky. Shadows breached the outer gates, enemy soldiers pouring through in waves. And once again, when command faltered, it was Kira who became the axis on which the battle turned. She did not wait for orders. She positioned herself at the choke point near the comm tower, where the enemy sought to cut off communications. Her shots cracked through the smoke, each one precise, dropping figures before they could advance. Soldiers rallied to her, forming a defensive line where none had existed moments before. The rifle guided her again, steady and sure, pulling her through the chaos with the calm certainty of inevitability. 4 hours they fought, and though the base burned, the comm tower stood. When the attack finally broke, dawn revealed the wreckage, bodies scattered, vehicles smoldering, walls shattered by fire. But the line had held, and once more, Kira remained standing. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with soot, her hands raw from the heat of her rifle. Around her, soldiers stared in awe, their expressions caught between fear and reverence. Command had tried to silence her, to erase her. But twice now, before dark and before dawn, it had been her rifle that decided the outcome of battle. And she knew, as she looked at the trembling figures of officers emerging from their bunkers, that no matter how hard they tried to bury her, she had become something they could neither control nor deny. The smoke still clung to the base long after the fires had been doused. Black plumes curled into the sky, carrying with them the stench of burnt metal, fuel, and flesh. Soldiers staggered through the ruins, their faces pale, their bodies moving with the dull rhythm of exhaustion. Medics knelt beside the wounded, their hands red, their eyes hollow. Over it all hung the weight of silence, the heavy pause that follows survival, when men and women cannot yet believe they are still alive. In that silence, Kira stood alone at the edge of the comm tower, her rifle propped against her shoulder, eyes sweeping the horizon as though expecting another wave. To her, victory never felt final. It was only the pause between storms. Word of her stand spread quickly. Soldiers whispered of the woman who had turned back an entire assault, who had stood when officers hid, whose rifle spoke with unerring certainty. Her name passed from mouth to mouth not with casual gossip but with reverence, as if her defiance had become something larger than flesh and blood. Command, however, received the news with clenched jaws and cold fury. They had expected her to vanish into the wreckage, a casualty neatly explained in after-action reports. Instead, she had emerged once more visible than ever, her legend carried by the very people they needed to control. To them she was no longer just a soldier. She was a threat to the fragile illusion of authority. She felt their eyes on her in the days that followed. Officers in polished uniforms watched her with smiles too tight, their words dipped in honey but sharp beneath the surface. They asked her questions she did not answer, offered her commendations she did not accept, placed her in front of cameras she refused to face. For every attempt to shape her into propaganda, she resisted with silence. The rifle remained her answer. When others sought speeches, she drilled her squad in the ruins of the outer wall. When they demanded photo opportunities, she rebuilt broken weapons, teaching the young recruits to handle steel with respect rather than fear. She was not theirs to mold, and they hated her for it. At night, in the dim barracks, some of the younger soldiers came to her quietly. They wanted to know how she did it, how she stayed calm when fire rained from the sky, how her hands never trembled, how her aim never faltered. She told them the truth, that fear was always there, but it was useless unless tempered into focus. That survival was not about glory but about refusing to let the enemy write the last word of your life. Some nodded, their eyes wide with hunger for her wisdom. Others shook their heads, unwilling to believe that something so simple could explain what they had witnessed. She never mentioned the truth she barely admitted to herself, that sometimes in the middle of battle she felt less like a soldier and more like an instrument, her rifle pulling her into actions too precise, too uncanny, as if it bore its own will. But command did not stop. A week after the attack, she was summoned once more to Colonel Varick's office. His polished boots gleamed as if untouched by war, his desk spotless, his gaze sharp. He spoke of honor, of duty, of discipline, words that meant little when measured against the ashes outside. He offered her a transfer again, this time to a secure position in the capital, where she would train recruits and stand as a symbol of resilience. She understood the offer for what it was, not promotion but exile. He wanted her far from the front, buried in halls of bureaucracy where her rifle could never speak again. She met his words with silence, her eyes never leaving his. Finally she rose, saluted with perfect precision, the first salute she had given in months, and left without answering. The salute was not respect, it was mockery thinly veiled, and Varick knew it. The next mission came without warning. Scouts reported enemy movements near the canyon routes, and a company was dispatched to intercept. Kira was placed at the head of the vanguard, a position both strategic and suicidal. She understood the intent. Command wanted her to fall not in exile but in battle, where her death could be dressed as heroism. But if they thought she would walk blindly into their snare, they had forgotten who she was. She prepared her squad carefully, drilling them in silence, ensuring they carried extra munitions, water, and medical kits. Every detail mattered. She did not trust the supply lines, nor the maps provided, nor the officers who assured them of minimal resistance. The soldiers followed her without question. To them she was no longer just a sergeant. She was the only shield they trusted. The march to the canyon was brutal. Heat shimmered across the barren earth, and the air reeked of decay from bodies left unburied. By nightfall they reached the jagged cliffs, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Kira scanned the terrain, her instincts prickling. Too quiet. Too still. The wind carried no sound of wildlife, no rustle of movement. She motioned for silence, her hand raised. The squad froze. Seconds later, the first shot cracked, ricocheting off the stone beside her head. The canyon erupted in fire. They had walked into an ambush. Enemy soldiers poured from the cliffs above, their rifles spitting death. The vanguard was caught in a crossfire that should have torn them apart in minutes. Command had set the board, believing this would be her grave. But once again the rifle spoke. Kira dropped to a knee, her sights snapping upward, each shot finding its mark. The squad rallied, forming a defensive circle, their panic dissolving as her calm spread through them like fire through dry grass. She barked orders that cut through the roar, moving them from one cover to the next, her rifle striking down enemies who exposed themselves for even a heartbeat. Time blurred into a rhythm of fire and movement. Bullets cracked the air, stones shattered, dust choked every breath. Soldiers screamed, some falling, some rising again. But wherever Kira's rifle turned, the enemy faltered. It was as though the canyon itself bent to her will, every shot echoing like a hammer shaping fate. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, until at last the cliffs fell silent. The enemy lay broken, their ambush scattered into ruin. Her squad, bloodied but alive, looked at her with eyes that no longer saw a comrade, but something greater, an anchor in the endless storm of war. When they returned to base, command could no longer pretend. Their attempts to silence her had failed again, and this time too many witnesses carried the story. Soldiers spoke openly of her, their voices defiant, their loyalty shifting away from officers in towers to the woman who carried her rifle like a banner. Command tightened its grip, issuing new rules, demanding stricter obedience, threatening punishment for dissent. But the harder they squeezed, the faster the truth slipped through their fingers. Kira had become more than a soldier. She was a symbol. And symbols could not be buried by orders or reports. That night, as she sat cleaning her rifle under the pale light of a flickering bulb, she felt a weight settle on her shoulders. Not fear, not exhaustion, but inevitability. Command would never stop. They would come at her again and again, until she was erased or until something greater broke. She looked at the rifle in her hands, the gleam of steel, the faint heat still lingering in its barrel. For the first time she whispered to it, her voice low, almost reverent. "If they want a war against me," she said, "then they'll have to fight you too." And in the silence that followed, she could almost swear the weapon answered with a quiet hum, as though it had always been listening. The days that followed. The canyon ambush were thick with tension. Whispers carried faster than official reports, spreading through the barracks, the mess halls, and the trenches. Soldiers no longer spoke of command's orders with reverence. Instead, they measured everything against Kira's name. To them, she was proof that survival was not luck but defiance, that the war could still be shaped by will rather than by orders written in offices far from blood and sand. Command tried to drown the whispers in propaganda, issuing broadcasts about collective effort and strategic brilliance, but the soldiers had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had followed one rifle through fire and come back alive. No speech could erase that. Kira felt the weight of those stares every time she walked through the base. Men and women paused in their work to watch her pass, their silence heavy with unspoken loyalty. It was not admiration she sought, nor was it power. To her, each set of eyes reminded her of the responsibility she had not chosen but could no longer avoid. She was no officer, no leader appointed by rank, yet she had become the figure others anchored themselves to. It made her uneasy, though she never let it show. If she carried herself with certainty, then maybe the younger soldiers would believe there was still a future beyond this war. She kept her rifle close, cleaning it methodically each night, the ritual both habit and confession. In its weight she found steadiness. But command saw only a threat. Colonel Varick and his council met behind closed doors, their voices low, their faces drawn. They spoke of control slipping, of loyalty shifting, of a narrative no longer in their hands. "She undermines the chain of command," one officer said. "She breeds defiance," another agreed. Varick remained silent, his eyes fixed on the map sprawled across the table. He was not a man who feared battle, but he feared the idea of a soldier who answered to no one but herself. To him, Kira was a crack in the wall of discipline, a single fracture that, if left unchecked, could spread until the entire structure collapsed. He gave no order that night, but his silence was heavy with calculation. The next mission came wrapped in urgency. Enemy forces had established a foothold near the old refinery plains, threatening to cut off supply routes critical to the front. A decisive strike was needed, command declared, and Kira's squad was selected to lead. On paper it looked like honor, recognition of her skill. But she knew better. The refinery was a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered concrete, a place where ambushes thrived and cover was scarce. It was a killing ground, perfect for eliminating a target under the guise of tactical necessity. She did not argue when the orders were given. She simply nodded, gathered her squad, and prepared. If command wanted to bury her, she would make them dig a deeper grave than they imagined. The march to the refinery was long and heavy with unease. The ruins rose from the horizon like broken teeth, jagged silhouettes against a crimson sky. Rusted pipes groaned in the wind, and the scent of oil still clung to the earth decades after the last machine had fallen silent. The squad moved cautiously, their boots crunching over shattered glass and twisted rebar. Kira felt the tension in their steps, the way they glanced to her for cues rather than to their appointed officer. She signaled silence, her hand raised, her body low. Every instinct told her they were being watched. The attack came at dusk. Shadows flickered among the ruins, rifles flashing as the enemy surged forward. Mortars thundered, sending debris raining down like jagged rain. The squad scattered, diving for cover where none seemed to exist. Kira's rifle roared, its shots slicing through the chaos with surgical precision. She moved as if guided, her steps unerring, her aim absolute. The refinery became a labyrinth of fire and steel, but wherever she turned, the rifle answered, dropping enemies before they could close in. Her squad rallied once again, not to orders barked through static-filled comms, but to the rhythm of her weapon. The battle stretched into hours, the ruins glowing with flames that turned the night sky orange. The refinery's towers collapsed one by one, showering sparks across the battlefield. Men screamed, steel shrieked, and the earth shook beneath the bombardment. Yet Kira moved as though untouched by the storm. Each time her rifle spoke, the noise seemed to dim, the chaos bending around her into clarity. Some swore later that she did not miss a single shot, that her weapon found its targets as if it could see beyond walls, beyond smoke, beyond the limits of human sight. To those who fought beside her, it was not a rifle, it was judgment, and she was its hand. By the time dawn broke, the refinery was nothing but rubble. The enemy had been driven back, their assault shattered, their dead scattered among the rust and ash. Kira's squad, though battered and bloodied, still stood. They looked at her with faces streaked in soot, eyes wide with the disbelief of survival. None of them doubted now. It was not command that had brought them home. It was her. The rifle hung heavy in her hands, its barrel smoking, its steel scarred but unbroken. For the first time she felt the toll, not just in her muscles but in her soul. Each battle won bound her tighter to a role she had not asked for but could not escape. When they returned to base, the atmosphere shifted. Soldiers cheered them, voices rising above the smoke-stained sky. Some reached out to touch her shoulder as she passed, as if confirming she was real. Command could not contain it. Their reports downplayed her role, spoke instead of coordinated strategy and tactical precision, but no one believed it. The truth had already rooted itself in the ranks. Kira and her rifle had carried the battle. For the first time she felt something dangerous stir in the camp, not just admiration but devotion. It frightened her more than the enemy's fire. Colonel Varick summoned her again. His office was dim, the air thick with the smell of ink and cold metal. He did not speak immediately, only stared at her with eyes sharp enough to cut. "Do you understand what you're doing?" he asked at last. She said nothing. He slammed his fist against the desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "You're breaking the army from the inside. Soldiers obey you, not their officers. They look to you, not me. That cannot stand." She met his fury with calm, her voice steady when she finally answered. "Then perhaps it is not me who has failed them." The words landed like a blade between them, and for a moment even Varick seemed shaken. When she left his office, she knew she had crossed a line that could never be erased. She was no longer just a soldier in their eyes. She was a rival to their authority, an enemy within their own walls. They would not stop until she was gone. But as she walked through the camp, past soldiers who raised their heads at her passing, she realized something else. She was no longer fighting alone. The rifle was her companion, yes, but now dozens, hundreds of eyes followed her with the weight of belief. And belief, she knew, could be more dangerous than any bullet. That night, as she sat alone in the dark, cleaning the rifle under the thin glow of a lantern, she understood the truth with clarity. Sharper than steel. Command would come for her again, harder this time, with more than just missions designed to fail. They would use everything: lies, power, betrayal. But she also understood something they could never grasp. They had built their war on orders and fear. She had built hers on survival, on defiance, and on the bond between a soldier and her weapon. And in the end, wars were not decided by who held the higher rank, but by who refused to fall. The base never truly slept anymore. The hum of generators, the distant bark of orders, the restless shuffle of boots across gravel. These sounds stitched together into a constant reminder that war did not wait for dawn. Yet beneath the noise lay something deeper, a tremor of unease that even command could not hide. Soldiers no longer carried themselves with blind obedience. Their eyes lingered too long on Kira when she passed, their words too hushed when they spoke her name. It was as though every man and woman had quietly decided that the war no longer belonged to the brass in their towers. It belonged to the one who had bled beside them, who had carried them through storms, who wielded her rifle as though it were the will of survival itself. Kira felt the shift more than she desired. When soldiers approached her in the mess hall, sliding trays beside hers, their silence was not casual companionship but reverence. When recruits shadowed her movements in drills, their eagerness was not mere discipline but devotion. She had not asked for any of it, yet it followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. She remembered faces of those who had fallen beside her, friends, comrades, voices silenced too soon, and wondered if they would have seen her the same way. The weight of expectation was heavier than any rifle. But she carried it because someone had to. Command's unease hardened into quiet hostility. Varick no longer spoke to her with veiled warnings. His silence was sharpened into action. Orders for her squad became more frequent, each mission harsher than the last. Supply drops arrived late or not at all. Maps came incomplete, coordinates deliberately vague. It was sabotage dressed as oversight, a slow grind designed to bleed her strength until nothing remained. But each time they pushed her into a corner, she pushed back harder. Each time they starved her of resources, she carved victory out of scraps. The soldiers noticed. The harder command tried to bury her, the brighter she burned. It was during one of those missions that the truth of command's desperation revealed itself. The squad had been dispatched to secure an outpost along the southern ridge, a crumbling structure overlooking the floodplains. By the time they arrived, it was clear something was wrong. The outpost was too quiet, its sandbags unmanned, its gates ajar. Kira signaled caution, moving first into the shadows of the ruined walls. The silence was suffocating, the kind of stillness that spoke not of abandonment but of a trap. Then, without warning, the walls erupted in fire. Machine guns from hidden nests tore into the squad, cutting men down before they could seek cover. Mortars followed, blasting the courtyard into shards of stone and steel. Kira dove behind a collapsed barricade, her rifle already braced against her shoulder. Her eyes tracked the flashes of gunfire in the dark, her shots striking each source with merciless precision. But the ambush was overwhelming, designed not for capture but annihilation. She realized then what command had done. This was not enemy cunning. This was betrayal. They had fed her position to the enemy, ensuring the outpost would become her tomb. For a moment, rage threatened to tear her focus apart. She forced it down, channeling it into clarity. If this was where they wanted her story to end, she would write it in fire instead of silence. Her squad rallied under her voice, moving cover to cover, dragging the wounded with them. Bullets shredded the walls, shrapnel sliced the air, yet they held together, bound by the steadiness of her commands. Every time despair threatened to break them, her rifle cracked and the balance shifted back. Soldiers swore later that it was not just accuracy but something impossible, the weapon bending fate itself, each shot turning chaos into order. Enemy nests fell silent one by one, their barrels smoking, their gunners collapsing into the dirt. The ambush unraveled not because it was poorly planned, but because Kira refused to let it succeed. Hours later, when the last shot echoed into silence, the courtyard was a graveyard. Her squad stood bloodied, numbers thinned but alive. They looked at her not with relief but with understanding. Command had not simply failed them, it had tried to erase them. The truth was raw and undeniable now, etched into every scar, every drop of blood spilled that night. Kira said nothing as they gathered their dead, their faces set with grim resolve. Words were unnecessary. They all knew what had happened. And they all knew what it meant. When they returned to base, command tried to dress the incident in lies. Reports spoke of enemy infiltration, of unexpected resistance, of heroic endurance under overwhelming odds. But the soldiers who had fought beside her carried a different truth, one that no report could erase. Whispers turned into declarations. Loyalty shifted from quiet faith to open defiance. Men and women began to train under her unofficially, gathering in the ruins at night to learn the rhythm of her rifle, the focus of her eyes. She had become something command could no longer control, not just a soldier, not just a leader, but a symbol of rebellion against the machinery that had tried to sacrifice them for convenience. Kira felt the storm gathering, though she never sought to lead it. She still sat in the dark each night, cleaning her rifle with the same ritual care, whispering her thoughts into the silence as though the steel itself could listen. Yet now, when she walked through the base, she felt not only eyes but footsteps following behind her, a quiet procession of loyalty that grew with each day. She had become the rallying point of a war within a war. One fought not only against the enemy beyond the walls, but against the rot within the chain of command. Colonel Varick saw it too. He stood at his office window late into the night, watching the camp below, the clusters of soldiers gathering around her like moths drawn to flame. His hands tightened behind his back, his jaw clenched. He had commanded armies across continents, crushed uprisings, silenced dissent. But this woman with her rifle, unraveled his authority with nothing more than silence and survival. For the first time in his career he felt something dangerous gnaw at him, fear. Not of her rifle but of what she represented. A soldier who proved that obedience was not the only path to victory. The next move he knew had to be decisive. Quiet sabotage had failed. Assigning her to impossible missions had only sharpened her legend. If he did not strike soon, she would eclipse him entirely. And once soldiers no longer feared their commanders, the army itself would fracture. He turned from the window, his voice cold as he summoned his aides. "It ends now," he said. "Before she becomes more than flesh and blood. His words carried not strategy but desperation. Because he understood, even if he would never admit it aloud, she already had. That night, as the camp settled into restless silence, Kira sat with her rifle across her knees. The steel was warm against her palms, the lantern light flickering across its scarred surface. She could feel it, the weight of what was coming. Command would not hesitate any longer. They would make their move soon. And when they did, it would not be on a battlefield of their choosing, but in the shadows of their own walls. She ran a cloth along the barrel, her movements steady, her breath even. Whatever came, she would not falter. Not for command, not for the enemy, not for the storm rising within the hearts of those who had chosen to follow her. The rifle gleamed beneath her hands, and for a fleeting moment she thought she heard it whisper back, not with words but with a promise. The air inside the base grew heavier with each passing day, as though the very walls carried the weight of secrets unspoken. Soldiers moved in tighter groups now, their conversations halting when officers approached, their glances sharper, their loyalties drawn. The split was no longer hidden. Some still clung to command, fearful of what defiance meant, but many more had quietly chosen Kira. It wasn't just about her victories anymore. It was about the way she refused to bow, the way she carried her scars without shame, the way her rifle seemed to speak louder than orders ever could. She had become their proof that they were more than pawns on a board. And proof, once seen, could not be unseen. Kira felt the tension humming like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Each night, she slept lightly, her rifle beside her bedroll, the lantern burning low. The camp was no longer safe, not from enemies outside the walls but from the men who wore the same uniform. She could feel command watching her every step, waiting for an opening, for a moment of weakness. Yet she did not flinch, did not retreat. She walked openly among the soldiers, training with them, eating with them, listening to their fears. In her silence, she offered them steadiness. In her eyes they found resolve. And with each day that passed, command's grip on them slipped further away. The breaking point came one evening, under a bruised sky heavy with storm clouds. A summons arrived, delivered not by an aide but by armed escorts. Colonel Varick demanded her presence at the central command tent. The message was clear: this was no request. Soldiers watched as she walked between the guards, their faces unreadable, their hands resting too tightly on their rifles. Whispers trailed her path. Some reached for her as she passed, subtle brushes of fingers against her sleeve, silent gestures of solidarity. Others clenched their jaws, rage simmering at the sight of their comrade treated like a prisoner in her own camp. By the time she reached the command tent, the storm outside had already begun to break inside. Varick stood behind his desk when she entered, his figure framed by maps and flickering lamps. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid with authority stretched thin. "You've gone too far," he said without preamble. His voice was a low growl meant to intimidate, but Kira did not so much as blink. "You've eroded discipline. You've undermined the chain of command. You've made yourself a legend, and legends do not obey. They destroy." He stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are not indispensable. No soldier is. The war is bigger than you." Kira's gaze never wavered. Her reply was calm, each word deliberate. "Then why does your army follow me instead of you?" The question hung in the air like a blade. For a heartbeat, Varick's composure faltered. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and behind his eyes flickered the truth he refused to speak, because they believed in her and not in him. His voice hardened into ice. "You leave me no choice." He signaled to the guards. "Disarm her." The tent erupted in movement. The guards advanced, rifles raised, tension crackling in the air. But Kira did not step back. Her rifle was slung across her back, the strap tight against her shoulder. She moved with sudden precision, faster than the guards anticipated. In one motion, she brought the weapon to bear, its barrel sweeping across the room. The guards froze, their eyes wide, their hands hovering at their triggers. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder outside. "You want me gone?" she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "Then try." The rifle's presence was not just a threat but a declaration. Every soldier in the camp knew what that weapon meant, what it had done. To face it was to face every victory, every survival wrestled from the jaws of defeat. The guards hesitated, sweat glistening on their foreheads. Varick's fury flared. "Do it," he barked. But no one moved. Fear bound them, not of Kira alone, but of what firing on her would unleash outside this tent. Because outside, soldiers had gathered. Word had spread the moment she was taken under guard. By the dozens they stood, ringed around the command tent, weapons at the ready, their voices rising in a low unified growl. Loyalty was no longer hidden in whispers. It was here, alive, undeniable. The guards inside could feel it pressing through the canvas walls, the weight of an army that had chosen its own commander. Kira's rifle remained steady, her eyes locked on Varric. "You can't silence what they've already seen," she said. "You can kill me. But you'll never kill what I've become to them." The colonel's face twisted, caught between rage and realization. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then the first shot cracked, not from Kira, not from the guards, but from outside. The sound ripped through the night like a signal. Chaos exploded. Soldiers surged toward the tent, shouting, their rifles raised. The guards inside faltered, their discipline unraveling under the tide of voices. Kira moved with deadly grace, firing a single shot that shattered a lantern and plunged the tent into shadows. In the confusion, she slipped through the canvas wall, emerging into the storm where her soldiers waited. Rain poured from the heavens, thunder shaking the ground. The camp was no longer orderly rows of discipline but a battlefield split in two. Soldiers loyal to command clashed with those who had rallied to Kira, gunfire sparking in the downpour, shouts lost beneath the roar of the storm. The night lit with muzzle flashes, shadows leaping across the mud. Kira's rifle barked again and again, each shot cutting through the chaos with unerring precision. She moved among her soldiers like a phantom, her presence steadying them, her aim unbreakable. The storm became a mirror of the war within. Lightning split the sky, illuminating faces twisted with rage and fear. Blood mingled with rain, bodies fell into the mud, and still the battle raged. Kira's soldiers fought not for orders, not for survival alone, but for her. They had tasted betrayal and chosen defiance, and now nothing could drive them back. Varric's forces fought with desperation, clinging to authority already slipping from their grasp. But the balance tipped with every moment she stood. Her rifle was not just a weapon, it was the center of gravity around which the battlefield turned.